All right, welcome to this week's Ronin seminar. We've got Nick Jackson, who is going to answer for us the question, does economics explain or legitimize development? Take it away.
Thank you so much. And to start off, I don't know if I will answer that question or actually make it more of a question. I'm a graduate of the University of Denver in international studies, where I focused on comparative politics, international economics, and specifically international development. But subsequent work has departed significantly from that, moving primarily into political economy, geography, and anthropology. And so in this seminar, I seek to introduce core aspects of my work by discussing economic development and the case of the Chad-Cameroon Petroleum Development Project, or CCPP. I begin with the standard story that is the Chad-Cameroon Petroleum Development Project, followed by the quote-unquote technical basis of the project's design, and then a reinsertion of politics and history into the story, which I argue not only invalidates much of the economic narrative, which I won't concentrate so much on in this seminar, but indeed isolates it from the on-the-ground realities of corporate exploitation in Chad and Cameroon. And so you'll likely recognize the CCPP narrative immediately, because this is the, if you will, common sense story told within classrooms, intergovernmental organizations, and media organizations. In short, Chad and Cameroon are countries in Central Africa. And in the late 1990s, in the face of entrenched poverty in Chad and Cameroon, the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund allied with an oil consortium made up of ExxonMobil, Petronas, Malaysia, and Chevron, as well as the governments of Chad and Cameroon, to develop and implement an economic and social welfare project designed to help Chad, especially, to gain the revenue necessary to care for its people at long last. However, even though the oil consortium was able to bring production online ahead of schedule, the social welfare portion quickly ran into problems and was quietly ended in 2008. The World Bank final report indicated that while their design and oil company implementation were satisfactory, the social welfare portion failed because the corrupt Chadian government especially did not hold up its end of the bargain. So I argue that within the conference rooms of the World Bank and IMF research and high-level policy-making departments, the CCPP narrative was embedded in standard World Bank and IMF legitimizations based on neoclassical economics, or what is commonly called economics. In brief, economics is based around consumer willingness and ability to pay for what we want, i.e. demand, and we are termed households, where consumption is located. In response, firms are formed within which entrepreneurs try to satisfy our demands at the greatest profit to themselves. The higher the price, the more they supply. However, the lower the price, the more we demand. Thus, given a particular technological environment and costless information, a freely functioning market will result in one price where demand matches supply, the standard supply-demand graph. World Bank and IMF economists portrayed the CCPP as arising out of improvements in understanding how economics actually works. That is, economic development doesn't necessarily arise spontaneously if government distortions are removed from the market. Instead, governments must actively facilitate development of proper institutions. And as we'll see in this seminar, this is not the first transition in quote unquote understanding the economy. So before the 1980s, economists in the World Bank and IMF assumed that countries developed as W.W. Rostow suggested, where technology and organization drove markets through 5 stages. And here it's broken into 3 major categories. So we have traditional subsistence, and then we have preconditions for takeoff created by modern science, takeoff through modern industry with limited scope, and then finally maturation by expanding from simple to more complex industries, and then in the end, high mass consumption. In order for late movers, which were basically countries that had not reached high mass consumption by the 1960s, in order for late movers to achieve this, there had to be some import substitution and humanitarian aid so that higher technologies could develop, or industrial aid. And this legitimized massive development loans for industrial projects like steel and dams. In the 1980s, as the increasing interest rates on the US dollar made variable rate, primarily dollar-denominated government development loans unpayable, World Bank and IMF economists reverted back to the more static comparative advantage, whereby countries performed best simply when government distortions were removed from manufacturing and currencies. And this allowed a country's resources to flow to that which they produced relatively most efficiently. So based on this, debt relief for developing countries was conditioned upon removal of state intervention in markets, as well as floating currencies so that their value would reflect supply and demand. Now this example above is a little different from the standard developing country example, because we have a traditional developing country, China, having a comparative advantage in clothing. And so in a free international market, they would produce clothing and trade with the United States for corn. Thus, the supply of corn and clothing would be maximized. Whereas if they both produced clothing and corn, then not only would the cost be somewhat higher of both, but also less would be produced. So in the 1990s, as poverty continued in developing countries, as it continued to be entrenched, even within countries that followed their policies, World Bank and IMF economists adopted neo-institutional economics, whereby information is no longer costless. And so therefore, information roadblocks caused countries to develop institutions which created price equilibrium conditions that were not necessarily the most conducive to economic growth. So in this graph, we have 3 possible equilibrium conditions depending on the institutions put in place by governments, one of which is, we would assume, the most effective economic growth. And so Oliver Williamson took neo-institutional economics and formed a matrix of development types, each more or less in equilibrium, but with different terms of political and economic development. So here in cell 1, we have basically the developed countries, which are developed economically and are also above threshold with mature liberal democratic institutions. And then we have, on the other hand, cell 4, which is authoritarian governments which are ruling over underdeveloped economies. And so Williamson suggests that for countries in cell 4, probably the only remedy in the short to medium term is humanitarian aid. So the sweet spot, if you will, for Chad and Cameroon, and the reason for the CCPDP is in cell 2, where we have economically underdeveloped countries or less economically developed countries with their political development above the threshold. And Williams suggests that in this context, developed countries can promote economic development by making deals between those offering aid and the political elite. So because the state is what we call provisionally efficient, that is, politicians have probably made all the deals they can to retain their bargaining power, outside inducement is necessary. And then finally in cell 3, we have authoritarian or totalitarian governments, but we have economic development. And for these countries, Williamson suggests that the only remedy is probably historical accident. So in this case then, to this, so we have the neo-institutional economics, and then more specifically, there's the idea that extractive industries, and especially oil, operate very differently from other industries. So economists and political scientists typically use 3 epistemological approaches, including trade theory, political incentives, and then regression analysis, such as we kind of see here, to suggest that oil interacts with markets and governments in exceptionally, if not uniquely, problematic ways because of the nature of production and trade. And so in this case, what we have democracy along the y-axis and oil reserves on the x-axis. And so these analyses across regions seem to show that as the oil reserves increase, democracy actually decreases. And so this has been termed the resource curse, or more specifically, the oil curse. And so scholars and policymakers like Sachs, Jeffrey Sachs, Michael Ross, and Joseph Stiglitz almost take it for granted that oil and other extractive resources are cursed. And they justify their assumptions in 3 main ways. First, the temporary comparative advantage of oil drives resources away from other tradables and non-tradable goods, like especially agriculture. Secondly, the capital-intensive nature of oil production means that revenue flows disproportionately from corporations to governments, and therefore the governments are less accountable to their own people as taxpayers. And then finally, oil incentivizes government elite to engage in corrupt extortionist practices because of the sunk costs required for corporations to engage in oil production. So, in summary, of the economic story, the oil curse, combined with Williamson's requirement for government facilitation or external intervention, This legitimized the CCPDP as the only hope for Chad's development especially, assuming that Chad had indeed reached an adequate threshold of political development. And then the subsequent failure of the CCPDP then proved that the Chadian government and people had not reached that threshold and perhaps therefore could only be helped by humanitarian aid. So outside of the classrooms and conference rooms, the CCPDP took on a very different character. The project came of age during the late 1990s and early 2000s in the face of strong pushback against petroleum companies and corporate-led globalization in general. This included the anti-WTO battle in Seattle, the 50 Years is Enough and Jubilee 2000 protests against what was called odious debt, the Other Economic Summit, and widespread protests against the sinking of the Exxon Valdez, the proposed sinking of Shell's Brent Spar platform in the North Sea, and the killing of Ogoni environmental activist Ken Saro-Wiwa and his associates by the Nigerian dictator Sani Abacha, and initially with the silence or little response from Shell Petroleum in Nigeria. And so what I have here is a screen grab of Friends of the Earth President Ricardo Navarro, then Friends of the Earth President Ricardo Navarro, who later prompted World Bank President James Wolfensohn to institute an extractive industries review for the World Bank. So for the World Bank in these circles, especially as told by former spokesperson Robert Calderisi in a book which he wrote, The Problem with Africa, and then Washington Post columnist Sebastian Mallaby, who wrote a book about James Wolfensohn called The World's Banker. The narrative was that the CCPDP was part of a battle between a leader, James Wolfensohn, who wanted to do good on the ground for impoverished people under corrupt governments, a battle between him and quote unquote good non-governmental organizations or NGOs that shared the same desire as Wolfensohn, and then quote unquote bad NGOs who looked at the CCPDP as simply a trophy to hang on their walls in Berkeley or Washington, DC. And so we have this quote from James Wolfensohn: "I have 1,000 Africans working at the bank who unanimously support the Chad-Cameroon pipeline, and I vigorously support the Chad-Cameroon pipeline. This is not for people in Berkeley to decide. This is for people in Chad to decide. And I think it's important that we have a proper balance between the Berkeley mafia and the Chadians. And I, for my part, am more interested in the Chadians." And so in this picture, we have James Wolfensohn with Bono, who is, if you will, an international celebrity of international development. So as Robert Calderisi describes it, Wolfensohn and a generous Exxon Mobil CEO, Lee Raymond, were able to use the self-interested, self-seeking metropolitan NGO movements against each other when attention drifted toward a World Bank-sponsored agricultural project in Tibet and away from the CCPDP. As Calderisi puts it, the pipeline did not exactly slip by in the shadow of the larger controversy. There was suspense about the final result until the very end. But in the home stretch, there was more concern with fine-tuning the design than overcoming any important hurdles. The storm was broken, and there was a sudden stillness in which reasoned arguments rather than sensationalist claims could again be considered. Then afterwards, however, Calderisi follows on with a standard narrative after the project was signed. In brief, we must abandon political correctness. African people are naturally entrepreneurial, but are constrained by corrupt government leaders especially from bringing their skills and ideas to markets that allow them to earn income to better themselves. As Calderisi quoted, "Throughout this period, the president of Chad showed no signs that he understood the bargain he had made with the rest of the world." So while World Bank economists and policymakers designed a satisfactory project, and oil consortium executives organized the oil production and corporate responsibility very well, NGO self-interest and African government corruption, along with cultural issues in Africa, largely destroyed the opportunity of Chad and Cameroon to develop. So in this narrative, the outside world tried, but as Calderisi puts it, the problem of Africa led to failure. So as a kind of a brief recap, the neoclassical economic narrative gives the impression that the World Bank and IMF are just following new information about how the economy works and using that to advise governments about what they must do to take care of their people. African governments typically don't follow this advice, and so development fails. The narrative on the ground, however, is that the World Bank president tried, along with the entrepreneurial Lee Raymond, to do good given immature African cultures. They were pressured and tried to deal with the pressure of corrupt government figures and self-seeking distant metropolitan NGO actors. And in the end, they succeeded in holding up their side of the bargain. However, the imperfections of African cultures and the pathological interventions of malcontents, if you will, led in the end to the failure of the project. They can only do their best. Now, when we move the camera back to take a broad view of the history and political economy of the area, the narratives and realities are far different and darker, though they are still coherent. In 1856, in Niger Delta, as Britain was transitioning from the slave trade and some years before they commenced direct colonial control, Baiki published a book in which he described the people of the Niger Delta in this way: "We've met on friendly terms with numerous tribes, all endowed by nature with what I may term the commercial faculty, ready and anxious to trade with us." The narrative as direct colonial control, however, was becoming entrenched, was very different. Now we have Mockler ferrymen representing people in the south of Nigeria, which have flatter hierarchies of leadership, as effeminate, infantile, and uncivilized. So we have this quote: "They are a savage-looking and hideous people, and at first sight it is difficult to believe that they are human. The chief was dressed in a loincloth and the long red coat of a Chelsea pensioner, while a lady's tiny straw hat was set coquettishly on one side of his head." The reality on the ground throughout the pre-colonial and colonial period, however, was very different, in that before or during the slave trade, the European powers supported the violence of that trade with exchanges, especially of large numbers of guns. According to Rowell, approximately 283,000 to 399,000 guns each year were traveling or were being exchanged in West Africa during the 1750s. And direct colonial control was no less characterized or highlighted by violence. So after Mockler Ferryman's quote, for example, about this quote unquote savage land, the British Empire attacked the chief Ijo city in Nigeria of Brass in February of 1895, killing an estimated 2,000 people. And the reason for this was because the people of Brass resisted the Royal Niger Company's continuing consolidation of monopoly power over palm oil production. So, in this context of looking at the history of Nigeria, is it surprising that the president of Chad used his project signing bonus in part to buy arms, that Chad fell into civil war during almost the same period as the rapid degeneration of the social welfare portion of the project, which was from about 2005 to 2010, and yet that oil production came online ahead of schedule. In fact, in February 11th, 2008, Reuters had a particularly telling narrative to this effect, where they described a rebel attack on Chad's capital that did not affect the country's then 140,000 to 160,000 barrels per day of oil output. And so, quote, production has continued as normal, the oil minister, Emmanuel Nottingar, said on Monday, amid burned papers and broken furniture at his ministry building. So, to conclude, and this is a sign outside of the World Bank headquarters, in my mind, addressing these inconsistencies of narratives has significant implications for the place of economics and the broader study of development, corporate exploitation, and movements of resistance and social transformation. Fundamentally, it brings to the forefront issues of accountability and exercise of power in all of these spaces, as Janine Weddle discusses very well in a book that she wrote, Unaccountable. So in subsequent years, what I've pursued then is a number of different strands on these issues. I published an article called Neoliberalism as Spectacle about the notion that debt-led economic development based on comparative advantage is actually what I call a legitimizing narrative, disconnected from the realities of business and the realities on the ground in quote unquote developing countries. I've also done an article where I examined social movement theory, which is actually a formal school within the study of contested politics, where the goal is to consolidate research around a kind of a core, coherent study of social movements, of contested politics. And so I wrote an article examining that in the context of what I call the contested academy. I've also been working on a deep dive, long-term deep dive into business literature in order to develop a framework for how corporate entities respond to opposition. I've done work on local washing and the CCPDP, the use of the local to basically sort of cleanse intergovernmental organizations, corporations, even international NGOs in terms of their narratives and approaches. And then more recently, what I did was an exploration of why former Burkina Faso President Thomas Sankara's work against odious debt and on behalf of independent development in Burkina Faso has basically been absent for a long time from either mainstream or oppositional literature, not only outside of the academy, which would not be surprising to me, but even within the academy. In short, that is some of the implications of this research. And with that, I'm open to questions and discussion.